Very good. Thank you, Nikki, and thank you everyone who's joined this next in the series of the Global Thought Leadership Institute webinar series. My name is Anthony Marshall. I lead thought leadership. Well, I lead the IBM Institute for Business Value, and I also chair the board of advisors at the Global Thought Leadership Institute. Lucia Rohili, who typically leads and facilitates these webinars, is unfortunately away this week. But I'm delighted to be joined today by Joe Kingsbury. So Joe is the global chair of Edelman Business Marketing. And just from Joe's LinkedIn, Joe currently leads Edelman Business Marketing, a global unit within Edelman focused on using modern integrated marketing to drive demand and revenue growth for business-to-business clients. Edelman Business Marketing brings together earned media, editorial, and content marketing capabilities, including audience development, enterprise branding, channel planning, creative account-based marketing, marketing automation, sales enablement, experience design, and CRM to help B2B companies deliver material business results. Joe is an advisory board member at Ignite USA, and we are very excited that this year Joe also joined us as an advisory board member of the Global Thought Leadership Institute. Previously, Joe's had several roles in different organizations, including Senior Vice President of Corporate Reputation and B2B at Fleishman Hillard, along with other roles. So, Joe, it's wonderful to have you here today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Anthony. Appreciate it.
So, Joe, I gave a little bit of a précis about some of your experience and background, but maybe you could share a little bit about how your career started, and sort of maybe what led in that sort of tapestry of one's career to end up working so directly on thought leadership.
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in the technology industry, and I remember coming out of school, maybe like a lot of other kids, didn't really have a clear sense of what I was actually going to do. But I love the tech industry, like I said, and so I ended up getting a job doing analyst relations, helping venture capital backed startups in the telecom sector really position themselves with industry analysts and to attract funding. That sounds fancier than it actually was, of course. I mean, basically what I was doing was a lot of reading, analyzing, writing, trying to make complex technologies sound a little bit simpler. And, I wanted to really keep learning about the tech industry. So then I ended up getting a job with a technology PR firm in New York. Spent a number of years actually supporting your company, IBM, all different parts of the company across software, hardware, venture capital group. And that's when I began to really learn that a company's success, or in this case, IBM, it wasn't just all about the product, right? It wasn't just the speeds and the feeds or the features and the benefits. And I really saw the power of ideas and thinking and how perceptions really have a tangible influence over the way that customers and other kinds of corporate stakeholders behaved. And so it was a tremendous experience working with IBM for those years. And so since then, I've had a chance to work in a number of different roles, including in digital marketing and analytics, social, MarTech, and then corporate reputation more broadly. So I've just over the years, I've really tried to kind of, grow into a five-tool player if there's any baseball fans out there.
Mm. So people, what I think you find, what I find as well, is that people arrive at thought leadership from all sorts of different directions and with different backgrounds. When I was looking at your LinkedIn, you studied government initially. Is that correct? So
I did, yeah.
what was your original aspiration, and how did that sort of pivot, and were the lessons you learned in those studies useful for you in sort of your future career?
It's an interesting question. So I originally thought I was going to go to law school after college, and so political science seemed like a pretty natural thing to study in undergrad. And I still remember. I mean, this is like a very well-known story by now, but I still remember the class where the professor was telling us about the debate between Nixon and Kennedy. and how people on the radio thought that Nixon won, and people who watched it on TV thought that Kennedy won. And I just thought that was the most fascinating thing. Again, sort of to this idea of like the power of perception and the way that you deliver your ideas, and just being a strong communicator in general. And I saw that that was really in all walks of life, being able to communicate effectively was just such a critical kind of skill to have. And so that's sort of how I got interested in the field to begin with.
Mm. What I know this is like your second tour at Edelman, right? So I think you
Yeah.
were there and then you looked at other things and then you came back. So clearly Edelman has really resonated with you, right? So what is it that really appeals about Edelman in terms of the work that you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, not to delve too much into the history, I guess, but coming out of college, I actually remember watching Richard Edelman on CNBC doing an interview in Davos talking about the trust barometer research that Edelman does every year, and which they launched at the World Economic Forum. I just really admired it. I was so impressed by the way that Richard would frame up these complex global issues of the time in very clear and simple ways. He also was absolutely not afraid to give his opinion on what he thought companies should be doing about some of those issues. And I just that really stuck with me. I thought, wow, this is another powerful communicator that is really giving guidance to global business leaders and CEOs on arguably one of the biggest stages in business. And so anyway, I had a friend who worked in the New York office and who loved working there. He asked if I would come in and meet with some of the leadership just informally. And I remember at the time they were trying to make the corporate reputation practice much more digital. So basically, infusing digital strategy and execution. I think at the time, digital was sort of much more associated with the consumer business. And so they brought me in to lead digital for the corporate reputation practice. And it was just tremendous exposure to a ton of awesome companies, to CEOs, like a super wide variety of interesting issues to try and solve. And then, as you had mentioned, Anthony, just for family reasons, I ended up leaving Edelman because my wife wanted to move back to St. Louis. We had two kids in Manhattan. It felt like a good time to change it up. But then shortly after, Edelman asked if I would come back and help the company figure out what they should be doing in the business to business world.
Right. So really, and this is pre you getting into thought leadership, right? So what was the segue from sort of your business activities? And I just prefacing that is I think you approach thought leadership very uniquely in the board of advisors because you come from that sort of heavy marketing perspective, and that is a different sort of perspective than some of the other people on the board. So how did you sort of transition? What was the segue to really bringing thought leadership into your sort of day-to-day activities?
Yeah, it's another interesting question to me. I guess I started thinking about thought leadership probably well before it was called thought leadership. I don't know when exactly that terminology came around, but one thing I realized about B2B companies in particular is that a lot of the knowledge that they have and a lot of the things that they want to talk about externally to connect with customers, with partners, maybe it's with investors, it didn't always necessarily fit into the news cycle, right? And so they needed another way of actually connecting with all of those different audiences. And so, the sort of logical conclusion is you got to tell your own story, and tell it on your own channels and other places. And so to make that interesting, you got to have a point of view. Now, ideally, the point of view would be something that could be helpful to the people that you're trying to connect with, not just informative, but actually helpful. And I guess that's when I realized that thought leadership was very much its own discipline. That's different than traditional communications, and certainly marketing and advertising.
Right. So in your role now, um, and just to step back for a second. So this is just in case people don't know where they are, Joe. This is the Global Thought Leadership Institute webinar, monthly webinar, and with Joe Kingsbury, Global Chair of Edelman Business Marketing. And I guess the question is, thought leadership is something that you engage with, like you create thought leadership, but you also work with clients to help them engage around thought leadership.
That's
So
right.
it's sort of like a duality here. Can you maybe describe that a little more?
Yeah, so it is let me tell you a story, and then I'll sort of get into I think what you're asking there, Anthony. So what, like, when thought leadership really became sort of more of a thing for Edelman, well, I shouldn't say for Edelman broadly, because they've done the trust barometer and all kinds of other intellectual property and research for a long time, but at least in sort of the world that I live in, probably about 8 years ago, I was working with a pretty well-known CEO of an enterprise technology company. We were supporting this executive with thought leadership. And he asked a pretty simple question: Joe, what's the business impact of doing this? And he said, like, I trust you. I really like the work. I think I know intuitively that it's having some kind of impact, but I'm really wondering, like, what is that impact and how do we measure it? And we didn't have a good answer for that. It honestly, it felt like a bit of a gut punch. In some ways, I'm not sound melodramatic about it, but it felt sort of existential for my career if we couldn't find a good answer to a pretty simple question. So we looked high and low for insights. We looked at all of the analyst firms, the management consultancies, et cetera. And there just wasn't a whole lot out there on this particular topic. And so that's when we had the idea to kind of create our own global research on the topic. We partnered up with LinkedIn to do a global study of B2B buyer behavior. And we've been doing it now 7 years strong. And the feedback from clients and even some of our competitors has been really, really positive. We try and come up with different themes that are timely every year to help our clients. And so, yeah, I guess that's when thought leadership really became a thing, if you will, in my career.
Right. So you talked about your competitor. Who do you consider your competitive set? Who are your sort of competitors?
It's a pretty wide range. So, if you think about, some of the management consultancies when it comes to things like audience research and go-to-market strategy, sort of market segmentation, some of the communications firms, uh, advertising, digital marketing, demand generation, even on some level, some of the public affairs specialty firms. It's a really, really wide mix, which is one thing that I think is fascinating, is that thought leadership, it kind of it almost sits at the intersection of all of these kind of different disciplines, where sort of business strategy, creative storytelling, data-driven strategy, they all kind of come together.
Mm. So in advising clients, without naming names or organizations, so could you sort of maybe share like a success story where you've really helped a client build a compelling thought leadership capability? How did you do that? How difficult or easy was it? And has it been able to sustain, and what sort of outcomes have they achieved?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, just to not make this an advertisement for Edelman, but I will disclose that we work with Microsoft as one example, and we've been really proud to support them on an annual piece of thought leadership research called the Work Trends Index. And one thing, so that actually began during COVID. And one of the things that really stood out to me, and I thought was just fascinating, was around all the ways that the pandemic and remote work was influencing how people work together. And so, obviously, they have all the data from, 365 and as well as LinkedIn. And so, one thing that stood out to me is that tight networks within companies got tighter, loose networks got looser. And that had a lot of implications for the companies that really rely upon cross team collaboration to sort of pollinate ideas and ultimately to innovate, to create new things. And I just remember thinking that was such a fascinating data point. I also, one thing that I'm really proud of, I can't personally take credit for this, but again, sort of in our partnership with the company, is that it was really intellectually honest, I would say, about the effects of technology and remote work, right? It wasn't a completely rosy picture. And they were very transparent about that too. So I really love the fact that it is intellectually honest. So in terms of I mean, Microsoft is, I mean, depending upon the day, the largest company in the world, and certainly there's so much that goes into their reputation. But at least in some small way, the Work Trends Index, particularly for a business leadership audience, has really been a strong piece of IP that is really sort of really brings to life all of the incredible insights that they have about the workplace.
Mm. Where with Joe Kingsbury, who's the global chair of Edelman Business Marketing. If you've got questions that you'd like me to sort of ask Joe, please put them in the chat. And Nikki is putting in information about the Global Thought Leadership Institute LinkedIn community that you can link from, and also subscribe to the GTLI's weekly newsletter. So Joe, just sort of going back to the marketing thing. And so there often is a lot of tension between thought leadership and marketing in organizations. There's lots of structural alternatives, organizational alternatives. Sometimes thought leadership is within marketing, within organizations. Sometimes it's distinct. Often people in thought leadership have the problem of continuing existence, like existential threats. What value are you delivering? And marketing is sometimes trying to make thought leadership something that may not really sustain as the ideal thought leadership. What's your sort of take on those sorts of things?
So I think that it's really interesting, and I wouldn't want to just throw out a simple answer about where the discipline should live within the organization, because every company might be a little bit different. But I do think, if you think about what makes for good thought leadership, right? And there's a couple of things that really sort of rise to the top for me. One is just having a fresh point of view to be able to tell people something that they don't already know. I think another one is to um, challenge people's beliefs on some level, right? So it could be, something that's counterintuitive, or at least provocative. And maybe most importantly is that I think it should be generous. And what I mean by that is you need to try and actually help the people that you want to engage. If your thought leadership is a thinly veiled sales pitch, people are going to see through it right away, and nobody wants that. We're all drowning in content. On some level, we're probably all competing with Netflix, right? And so if you're genuinely trying to help somebody learn and to give them value that they can use, that's what will stand out. And I think that, like, all of those different sort of parts of the organization that you mentioned, again, different for every company, but you got to find the right sort of collaboration among those groups to make sure that I think that it meets some of those basic criteria.
Mm. So jumping sort of back to something you said earlier, when you and Edelman really started that thought leadership journey, although I would argue that the trust barometer is thought leadership, and Edelman's been in that space for a long time.
Completely.
Yeah. But when you really delved into it, you said that you engaged with LinkedIn. So ecosystems really big part of thought leadership today. But you started that early. What made you do that? What made you take that decision? What was it about LinkedIn specifically that you thought would really work in terms of a collaboration?
Well, I mean, we talked to a number of different partners. We talked to some of the analyst firms, even some of the management consultancies, and I won't name names, but I think what stood out for us with LinkedIn was just the sort of core idea behind the research that we wanted to do just instantly clicked with them. And I think they sort of shared our fascination with, hey, can we quantify and actually map out the influence on buyer behavior of something that is arguably pretty subjective? And they realized that it hadn't been done before. So I think just the fact that they shared, they really understood what we were going for, and they certainly have helped us, shape it together. But they really sort of took to the idea, and I think believed in what we were trying to accomplish. And so that was, I think, really the main reason. It's just the beginning of that relationship. That's why we decided to work with LinkedIn.
Okay, great. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm going to jump on. So number one, what are best practices for integrating thought leadership into onboarding or enablement journeys for clients post sale? So this goes to some of your hidden buyer analysis that you've done in your most recent thought leadership piece.
It's a really good question. I think, maybe even stepping back, if I'm tracking the question correctly, I think that one thing that companies really need to understand um, is what's going on with the sales process and the customer engagement process where there might be barriers or some kind of friction resulting from the fact that your customers, your prospects, et cetera, aren't completely understanding the value proposition that you have to offer. So basically, it's kind of a long-winded way of saying if they're not truly understanding the story the way that you want them to understand that story in order to help drive some kind of commercial outcome, you really want to pinpoint what's going on with that so that you can then have a starting place to think about, where should we potentially focus our thought leadership efforts? And then how do we want to, sort of onboard people and integrate that into our process? So just super tactically now, I think getting to the heart of the question is for what we see in some of our work with, B2B companies is that they will train salespeople to use insights from thought leadership as a door opener, for example, to go and call upon clients and potential clients and ask them, hey, we just, generated all these pretty interesting insights on this topic that we believe is important to you. Are these things that you're facing as well? Are there insights in here that could potentially help you solve your problems? And again, kind of going back to what I was saying before, it's that like genuinely sharing value and sharing knowledge that can help the client that oftentimes will create that air cover, if you want to call it that, in order to help make the sales process more effective, in order to help engage senior decision makers. I think that's an important point is all the time we have companies asking us about how they can sort of work their way up the food chain within an organization. And they say, we're not getting the attention of the C-suite. And so therefore we've been relegated to procurement. And now we're only getting graded on price. So how do we elevate our story in order to break into the C-suite? So again, there's all kinds of tactical things I won't sort of list off here, but I think at a basic level, it's like how can you equip the various people within your company to come to the table with a fresh point of view and ideas that can help basically amplify what you're trying to do as a business.
Okay, and sort of consistent with what you just said, the second part of this question was, can you share examples of thought leadership that successfully prompted internal advocacy or change readiness within buying groups?
Yeah, so internal advocacy, I'm guessing like within the customer organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's a great question, and we actually just did a study that came out a couple of months ago that is all about hidden buyers. So it's called Invisible Influence: Unlocking the Power of Hidden Buyers. And the reason that we wanted to look at that particular topic, and I'll give full credit to Bain Consulting, by the way. Last year, they did an interesting piece of research with LinkedIn, which talked about the nature of buyer groups, right? And so the kind of core idea behind that research was that if you think that you're selling to or trying to develop business with an individual buyer, you're playing the wrong game, because the game is actually that B2B buying is a team sport, and you need to get multiple different people who have different wants and needs on the same page and kind of give them the ability to come together and to say yes to you, right? And so, as part of that research, one of the things that they talked about was the hidden buyer, and this idea that if you're not the target buyer, like if you're not the primary sort of user or of a product or a service, that those hidden buyers still have tremendous influence over B2B buying. And in fact, they end up vetoing, somewhere around 50% of the companies that might be on a short list for various reasons. So to come back to the question, we studied this topic of the hidden buyer to understand how do they behave, what kind of information do they need, what influences their behavior in a way that could be positive for you. And one of the things that we found was that, for one thing, they're not box checkers, right? They're not narrowly minded and only thinking about uh, the price. They're not only thinking about procurement related things. They're not only thinking about operations. Particularly the senior leaders in those functions are actually thinking much more strategically about, should we be buying from this company? Should we partner with them? Can they be viable for us, long term? And so these people, they actually they want to learn. They genuinely want to learn things about their industry. And, in doing that, if you can teach them about their industry, if you can do that successfully, that is a really powerful way to separate you from your competitors. And even for companies that are not necessarily the biggest companies, right? Like nobody got fired for buying IBM. You know that, Anthony. And so, how do you compete against that? It's not just more awareness. It's not just more familiarity with a logo. It's actually being associated with some kind of powerful idea that's um, going to make that buyer perceive value in what you have to offer.
Okay. So you mentioned one of the studies you produced in 2025. So the invisible influence, unlocking the power of hidden buyers. In 2024, the road to thought leadership is paved with empathy. So my question is, how do you decide which topic when? What's the process that you go through internally to sort of make a decision around that?
It's actually not, it is partly an internal process, but I would say it's actually mostly external, in the sense that we just go out and we talk to our clients about the challenges that they're facing. And then we really aim to understand our clients really deeply so that we can look around corners and try and
Yeah,
anticipate some of the problems that they need to solve. I mean, that's really it at a basic level.
yeah.
And then of course we're going to do the analysis on, what's performing, what's resonating with clients so that we can understand where do we need to scale back or really lean into the stuff that clients might find particularly vexing. But not to sound Pollyanna about it, but we should be trying to help our clients solve problems, and that's it, that's kind of the foundation of it.
So I was going to ask, my next question was going to be, how do you syndicate to clients? But there's a question in the chat that's even better and more specific. So I'm going to read that out to you. And so how do you create internal alignment so that the insights generated by thought leadership are not only reaching the invisible buyer, but also being effectively used by the sales team once the buy becomes visible?
I think you got to get the sales team on board early, and by early I mean day one. So when you're we let me actually flip it around just to sort of make the point, but we will often see companies come up with sort of topics and ideas for thought leadership in a little bit of a vacuum sometimes, because it seems interesting at the time. And you might, I mean, depending upon what kind of, thought leadership you're trying to develop, this is a process that could take months, right? And um, so they'll sort of get pretty far down the road of, creating something, and then maybe they get it out in the world and they're asking, account managers, client representatives, salespeople, they're asking them to go out and use it. And what they'll hear is, I don't know, I'm talking to the clients all the time, and this is not really relevant to what they're thinking about, right? And so it's why I say that is it's you got to engage sales really early to understand what are they hearing in the trenches, that is vexing for clients, and that really is the starting point. And then even beyond that is sort of working with those teams to understand how would you, let's imagine that we've produced this thing, how would you envision yourself actually using this in a conversation? Where do you think it could take the conversation? Would it be beneficial for them? Would it be beneficial for us as well? And so I think at a really basic level, it's just about getting that, the cross team collaboration early. And I would say, beginning at the end, if you want to think of it that way. One other point I'll make on that, just to punctuate it, is this idea of beginning at the end, I think is so important before you get into anything like, conducting research, thinking about your segments, even designing, whether if it's a survey, designing questions, is you really want to imagine like what does this story sound like 6 months from now? And do we think it's going to be relevant 6 months from now, given how fast things move? And how do we think it's going to resonate with the people we're trying to engage with? So it's a little bit of that, if you've ever heard the story about Jeff Bezos at Amazon, he used to have this exercise where if somebody wanted to come up with a new product or go into a new market, he would ask them to write out the press release first to really sort of have that cohesive thinking about what impact is this ultimately going to have.
That's very, very interesting. So when you think about a piece of thought leadership, what characterizes thought leadership? So what does a piece of content need to contain or possess in order to be thought leadership? What absolutely has to be there?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like I was saying before, is I mean, the fresh point of view. It really should be provocative or counterintuitive. I mentioned the thing about being generous. I mean, some of the other things that we hear is, again, it can't be a thinly veiled sales pitch. I think that's something that in particular is very sophisticated, um, decision makers, they're going to see right through that very quickly. I think another interesting thing, again, sort of picking up on this idea of we're all drowning in content, we're all competing with, Netflix and sports and all of that, is it's just got to be appealing on some level. And, and it's like we're not the arbiters of that. I think that's, everyone has a different sort of version of what appealing or fun or enjoyable is. But one thing that we do hear from B2B decision makers is that they believe thought leadership can be intellectually rigorous but fun at the same time. And I think, again, we have so many different things competing for our attention. It might be difficult to get somebody to sit down and read a 100-page white paper, for example. So just thinking about some of the formats that, sort of work for modern, audience consumption. And then, just one other point I'd mention on this is actually having, an author or a spokesperson that is, relatable and credible on the particular topic. Another thing that we see with some companies is that their kind of knee-jerk instinct is to roll out the CEO or to roll out, some other sort of C-level officer. And in some cases, that's absolutely appropriate. They might be, sort of, absolutely the right sort of voice for some topics. But really, what buyers want to hear most is like true subject matter expertise, and they want to know that whatever insight is that they're getting, that it's coming from somebody who truly understands deeply what it is that they're talking about, and then they're not just giving you talking points. So for a lot of our clients, that's kind of an eye-opening thing where they realize, oh, maybe we could get the engineer, maybe we could get the whoever it might be, because they actually are the most credible and authentic source on something. So those
Mm,
are just maybe like a handful of things that I do think, at least in terms of what our research tells us, reflect high quality thought leadership.
Do you think thought leadership needs to contain data, like data of some description, like proprietary
Yes.
data, or so
Yes.
some type of data?
Yeah, so data is essential. I mean, it could be qualitative, right? It doesn't always have to be massive quantitative
Mm,
studies,
mm,
but there does need to be some kind of data to back up, what it is that you're trying to say. And it doesn't always need to be proprietary. In fact,
mm,
one of the things that we hear from buyers is that they actually prefer when companies, when individuals also can weave in relevant and credible points from third parties
mm,
outside of your own company. And so it's put simply, it's a little bit of that effect that, like, if multiple credible people are saying this thing, it's more likely to be true.
mm. Thinking back to the point you made about Microsoft. You went to Microsoft. They've been very successful. Microsoft's been very successful with the skills sort of study that they've done. It doesn't strike me as being completely obvious that that's that I'm. What is the relationship between that that series of studies with what Microsoft does, right? So how did, and yet it's been very successful. So what characterized success in that environment, and what was it that sort of made you think about that as being the topic for Microsoft, and how did they receive it, and how did you pitch it? You know?
Yeah. Well, and again, just to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of Microsoft or any of the executives over there, but I can give you my point of view on the question, which is that I think they wanted to be really they wanted to continue to be known and evolve their reputation around the future of work, not just particular platforms or specific technologies, but how is it, I mean, especially now with AI, right? How do humans sort of operate in the workplace um, in order to be successful? And I think that, for some, that's a pretty high level topic that could go in a lot of different directions. And I think that again, sort of looking at all of in their case, the proprietary data that they have on the way that people behave and interact within the workplace was just such a powerful jumping off point to sort of, to shed light on those topics. And so I think I think that it probably seemed like a pretty natural way of kind of telling that story. And now every year they're coming up with a new theme. They just came out with a theme around the frontier firm, which is this notion that, and some of you may be familiar with this, but this notion that AI in particular is really enabling smaller, agile, sort of very, tightly concentrated teams of people to do some pretty incredible things. And so just another example of a timely, issue that I think people are interested in.
So in some ways, you sort of looked at Microsoft and sort of thought, let's take a more fundamental examination of what their business is. And if you think of it in terms of sort of people productivity and workplace productivity, you get to that point about skills and teams and things very easily, but you need to sort of not be superficial in the way that you approach it. Is that a fair rationalization?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And it's, and even if you think about and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of any of the companies I'm going to mention, but Uber is about mobility, right?
Mm.
Right. And at some point that's going to evolve. And you're seeing how that's evolved with Tesla as well, right? They were cars, but now they're getting into robotaxis and AI. And, they have a vision of the future that is sort of more than just the obvious sum of the parts. And I think that that is, um, as companies think about their thought leadership efforts, you're not going to do thought leadership around a product, right? That's just not that. There's a different role for sort of explicit product marketing, and it's a very important role. But where thought leadership really sort of what thought leadership can do, I think, is sort of condition the environment, particularly with very senior, sophisticated decision makers that are thinking about big topics and trends, is to sort of be more receptive to your point of view and to understand sort of your vision as it relates to their future, the future of their industry.
And do you go through that sort of activity with your clients? Do you sort of say, okay, think deeper, think more deeply about this, think more, don't just, I'm just going to go back to micro. Yeah, it could have been very easy if you just say, do a paper on cloud, right? Or do
Right.
this. And you didn't, you sort of, you went to the foundation, the fundamentals, the essence of their business. Is that what you do with other clients? Is that part of your process in working with them?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a balance across all those things because, again, there is absolutely an important role for the product marketing piece. But then what we want to try and do is a step back and think a little bit bigger about, because oftentimes there's going to be a number of different audiences that our clients really want to effectively engage, and the customer is certainly always, typically at the center of that. But there might be policymakers and regulators. There might be investors that are also trying to think big picture about, who should we invest in, as well as other types of corporate stakeholders, and then including also the media or people who are influential in terms of driving conversation. And so And so you take all those things together and you have, I don't know, maybe it's like a big complicated Venn diagram, but you're trying to figure out what is going to be really compelling to all of these different audiences at one time, and what can we do for each of them to really make this resonate with them. And so again, maybe to come back to just the crux of your question, Anthony, is um, you could do a white paper on cloud, and that might actually be interesting to some of your customers, but it's not something that, for example, a journalist who covers the technology industry is going to write about because it doesn't meet their needs around trying to tell timely stories.
Yep, very good. So we have a couple of minutes left. How we met was in the GTLI symposium, which was in February of this year. You came and presented some content, so on thought leadership. It was very exciting, and you know your excitement in the discipline was infectious, and we invited you to become part of the board of GTLI, and you've been with us for what, 4 or 5 months now. What was it that attracted you to the GTLI and sort of engaging with the community in that way?
Yeah, and by the way, thank you again for the invitation to come down and speak in Houston. You know, I wasn't totally sure what I was getting into, but honestly, I think just the caliber of the people involved in GTLI has blown me away. I mean, you and Cindy with IBM, the other leaders from KPMG, EY, Deloitte, McKinsey, there's just so much brain power involved. And so when you guys invited me to join the board, I knew that I would love spending time with you and learning from you. So that's kind of my selfish reason for getting involved. But more broadly, I think that thought leadership is growing up in a pretty big way. It's not just about having smart opinions, it's really becoming this kind of its own business discipline that can have real impact. And so like I believe that GTLI is going to help define what that should look like, and to help professionals be great at it. And so I've joined the board to be a part of that conversation and contribute in some way.
So one of the gaps that we saw in this symposium was there were several people that were sort of earlier in their career, and you know it's if you look at the people on the board, people in thought leadership, they're coming from so many different disciplines and so many backgrounds that one of the innovations that we're looking to put in place in the next symposium is to have sort of some informal mentorship where people that are earlier in their career can sort of nominate to be on the table of someone experienced like you at lunch and have a conversation about whatever they want to have a conversation about. Do you think that sort of mentoring, that sort of support framework is useful in the environment? Do you see a lot of people sort of really struggling to, you know, wanting to make a career but struggling to make a career?
100%. I mean, I think just in general, I think, mentorship and just simply talking to people. I mean, as basic as that sounds, we often, well, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes we don't get as much of that real talking with people as we would like to have in our professional lives. So 100%, I think that the mentorship, particularly in this area, I think is super important. And um, not to give you a non sequitur here, but here's why I think it's especially important in thought leadership. So I had mentioned earlier that thought leadership, it kind of sits at this fascinating intersection of business strategy and storytelling and data, and it's a very unique blend of art and science. Because on the one hand, you got to have ideally some kind of rigorous research, and the insights to deliver something of value. But on the other hand, I think there is a bit of imagination that is involved. And so finding a bold idea or some kind of human truth or maybe an unexpected angle that can really shift the way that somebody thinks. And so that's one of the things I really love about the idea of thought leadership is that it's not a solo sort of endeavor. It's definitely a team sport because you need all of these different kinds of people to come together and to bring it to life and to make sure that it resonates. So um, to bring it back to the mentorship thing, everything I was just talking about, this is something that really comes up often when I talk to our people and even people outside of the company is, what do I need to do to be yeah, to really be great at this discipline? And I think a big part of it is doing the cross training and really getting maybe even a little bit uncomfortable to learn all kinds of different skills that may not feel like, well, it's not my major, but I could have a minor, right? Maybe my major could be in creative storytelling, but my minor might be in something like data analytics. And I think that the more sort of well-rounded people can become, it's just going to set you up to be really successful.
So last question, Joe, and this can be a classic or something contemporary, or indeed one of your own pieces. Do you have a favorite piece of thought leadership over the years?
Well, and I'm not just saying this because you're with IBM, Anthony, but I am a little bit biased having sort of been a part of the Smarter Planet days. I know I'm definitely dating myself when I say that, but I think that IBM really set the standard and really pioneered a lot of the ways of thinking and acting when it comes to thought leadership, with everything that the company did around Smart Planet and focusing on really telling stories about some of the biggest challenges and opportunities in really important sort of vertical industries. And that at the time, that was a really sort of radical approach, I think, right? It wasn't just about let's talk about our products. It was let's talk about sort of these mega trends in energy, in finance, in industrials, so on and so forth. So again, honestly, I have to say that that is like one that's always left a lasting impression on me.
So you'll be happy to know that Smarter is coming back to IBM, and so where the organization is starting to re-engage around Smarter.
Wow.
So that's good. That's good news. So thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your experience and insights there. We have a screen just come up. So as anyone that's on the call knows, this is part of the monthly webinar series. Usually Lucia Rohili from McKinsey leads these. Lucia's out this week. And so I've been here with Joe. If you would like to follow us on LinkedIn, here is the link. Please do so, or just look at LinkedIn for GTLI. If you want to know more about the events happening, joining the GTLI mailing list, and as I also mentioned, really join the community on LinkedIn, and absolutely subscribe to our weekly newsletter, which presents the very best of thought leadership. Right now, we're looking at the top 100 thought leadership producers, and so we're about 2/3 of the way through in the weekly newsletter, profiling all of those. So where if you look back at the history of that, you'll see fantastic thought leadership from the top 100 producers, including Edelman, is there, and the content that they produce. But thank you again, Joe. It's been a great conversation, and thank you everyone for joining, and see you next month.
Thanks all.